you very much, Professor Yuan. It's my great honor to speak to you. I'm grateful for the Guangdong University for International Studies and the School of International Relations for giving me this opportunity. The reason I support the Belt and Road Initiative is because I think the Belt and Road Initiative represents a very important model for development for the world, especially for the developing nations, which has been missing for decades. But also the Belt and Road Initiative is an important modus operandi for establishing peace and security in the world through economic cooperation. And therefore I support the Belt and Road Initiative and the other initiatives presented by China, like President Xi Jinping, the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. Because the world badly needs these things. We are in a very precarious situation due to conflicts we have in the world, and there is need for some sort of new wisdom to be added to the global governance system, because the previous one has failed miserably and has brought us to the brink of global war. My presentation is in 3 parts. It's going to be a bit long, very detailed, because it's important. I present this for the first time internationally, and I'm presenting a methodology which has not been used, for example, in what I call debunking the debt trap narrative, that the Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese debt trap for developing nations to take advantage of them for its own foreign policy and its own strategic interests, which I don't believe is the case, but it has to be proven. The second and third part pertain to the next 10 years of the Belt and Road Initiative. The second part will be on why it is very important to have state-backed credit for infrastructure development, especially, the same way China did in the first 10 years, and that has to be continued and expanded. And the third one, what should we build with the new credit we generate in the next 10 years and probably the next decade. The first part is on how to debunk the debt trap narrative in 3 simple steps. I have studied this problem, which was intended to smear and put a negative light on the Belt and Road Initiative and China's policy, especially in developing nations. I have studied this in 2018, when it was first popularized internationally through an operation by the US State Department in May 2018 by commissioning 2 students in the Harvard School, the Harvard University Kennedy School. 2 students who were not really students. One was a former official of the Department of Homeland Security, Sam Parker, and Gabriela Chevitz, who was from the US Department of Defense. Today she is actually a senior official in the Department of Defense of the United States. So these 2 students were commissioned by the State Department to write a study on China's ambitions and its credit policy of loaning money to nations to increase its influence internationally. So the whole study was actually designed by the State Department, but the students had to provide the background to that. I have discussed this on CGTN and other locations. I'm not going to go through that, but it was a political operation. The first ever well-documented debt trap story was actually written by Rosa Luxemburg in 1913. Rosa Luxemburg is a known Polish-German socialist. She wrote in The Accumulation of Capital a special chapter on how the British and French, but mostly the British, trapped Egypt into a massive debt trap after financing and building the Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869. That was a very important infrastructure project that changed relations in the world, but it was used by the British to exploit Egypt, first taking all the land, agricultural land to produce cotton for its own industries, but also it led later to the colonization of Egypt in 1882. So that's a very good example of a real debt trap from history. But as I said, in 2018, the United States pushed this story, and since then I have studied the 5-6 cases which are made famous, like Sri Lanka, Kenya, Pakistan, Zambia, and Montenegro, to find out if this is true or not. So what I found out is that not only it's not true, but there is a pattern, similarities between all the cases of these countries. And therefore I wanted to establish a method of analysis which every serious researcher, unbiased researcher or unbiased journalist even, can actually take any country which is being promoted as a victim of Chinese debt trap and show why it's not true in 3 steps. So the researcher has to answer 3 major questions. What is the composition of the debt of that country in terms of who owns the debt, the quality of the debt, which is often not discussed, I'll explain that, and the source of financial trouble these countries are undergoing. Does it have to do with China or is it something else? So these are the 3 main questions that have to be answered to show if the debt trap narrative is true or not. So when I do my research, I don't go to Google, I don't go to the mass media, and I don't go to think tanks. I don't trust them to be source of good information. What I do is I go to government documents, World Bank documents, United Nations documents, official documents. So in the case of Sri Lanka and Kenya, I went to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka in 2022 when Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt, and there was a lot of disturbances, and the president had to flee the country. Everybody was talking about China debt trap, China debt trap. So what I did, I was asked actually by a consulting company to figure out if this is true and if it will affect the Belt and Road Initiative and Sri Lanka's relationship to China. So what I did is I went to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the Finance Ministry, and I looked at their record since 2017, their books. What is going on in Sri Lanka financially and economically. In the case of Kenya, there's a very simple way. You can go to the Central Bank or to the Finance Ministry and try to find foreign, it's called foreign holdings or foreign liabilities of the country. You can just search it and you'll find a document. You will find something like this. That in the case of Kenya, which I said, it's just 4 pages. 4 pages, but they're enough. Actually, there is a lot of information. You find there that it's divided. This is too little. I will expand it later. Bilateral debt, which is state to state. Multilateral debt, which is by international institutions like World Bank, IMF, and other Paris Club. And then commercial debt. Okay? When you look at the story in the mass media or some think tanks in the United States or Europe discuss this problem, the image you get is this. This is Sri Lanka's problem. China, 90% of the debt of Sri Lanka. So every report starts with how Sri Lanka is being victimized by China, but they don't provide the numbers for why they think this is the problem. When you finish doing the study, this is what you get. This is the truth. China's share of Sri Lanka's debt in 2022 was only 10% of all Sri Lanka's debt. This is the truth, this is the narrative. Okay? So when I looked at the numbers, you see China 10%. This is according to the Finance Ministry of Sri Lanka. The Asian Development Bank as much. The Asian Development Bank is based in Japan. It's more influenced by the United States than by Asian countries. The World Bank, IMF, 20%. Japan has as much as China, but nobody talks about that Japan has victimized Sri Lanka. And then you have the elephant in the room. 47% of Sri Lanka's debt was from bondholders, private investment funds, and banks who who buy debt of developing nations. Okay? So that was the reality. So this is owned mostly by two major financial investment funds in the United States and Britain. The America, it's called BlackRock, and Ashmore in Britain. They own 39% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt, 4 times more than China's debt to Sri Lanka, by two financial firms, one American and one British. So I'm not going to expand on this. This is just a linear development of Sri Lanka's debt, but relationship between the Chinese debt and the other debt. So we go to the details of this sheet. We start with the bilateral. So when you read an article about Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, any country, they will say China is that country's largest bilateral creditor. And which is often true. But that's not the whole story. If we look at China's loans, 70% of all the bilateral. Why? Because the Chinese policy banks, the Export-Import Bank, the Development Bank, the Construction Bank, so on, the 4 big banks of China are state-owned banks, and China prefers to do state-to-state cooperation. So the loans are often from state to state. That's called bilateral. Okay? Chinese private banks, I don't think the Chinese private investors, they are not interested in loaning money to other countries. The United States share of the bilateral, because the United States does not do state to state, is only 1% of China's. So yes, bilateral, China is Kenya's largest creditor. But this is just the top of the sheet. Huh? So we go to the next level. Yeah, this is the image you get for the bilateral. You have to pay attention to bilateral. Then you go to multilateral, which is the second section. And you look who is there. So we still have this from the bilateral. China has 70% of the total bilateral. Then the multilateral, who are the big guys? The World Bank. This is the International Development Association, belongs to the World Bank. Okay? So they have twice as much loans to Kenya than China. Okay? So totally, the bilateral, China is not featuring here because China is interested in this area. So this, multilaterals, they have loaned 3 times more to Kenya than China. Okay? So already there you have somebody who is bigger than China and Kenya. Then we have at the bottom of the bill is the commercial loans. And pay attention to the international sovereign bond holders. By the way, all these numbers are in Kenyan shillings. So we don't, the Kenyan shilling is 0.0077 of a dollar. Or a US dollar is 129 Kenyan shillings. We don't care about that, we just look at the proportions, okay? So these are Kenyan shillings, these are not dollars, okay? So we can do a calculation somewhere else, but we look at the proportions. So the international sovereign bondholders, as I mentioned, like BlackRock and Ashmore and Aberdeen and many others, they hold 1 trillion shillings, which is more than China's in Kenya. Okay? So when we look at the bilateral, multilateral, and commercial debt of Kenya is 6 trillion Kenyan shillings, or about $40 billion. Okay? So when we divide it, we get this picture. China has only 15% of Kenya's debt. The multilaterals have 50% of Kenya's debt, and the commercial have 25% of Kenya's debt. Okay? So China is, like in Sri Lanka, is a minority creditor. So once again, this is the narrative, this is the image you get in the American and British and European media. China is the problem in Kenya. This is the truth. China is just a small player in Kenya's financial troubles. There will be other issues, of course, which is the quality of the debt. Why Chinese loans to those countries qualitatively different than other loans? This is the second question the researcher has to answer. This is very, very, very important because that will lead us into the second part about why China's credit policy is the correct one. And so there are general features that Western loans, especially the commercial loans, are short-term, like 5-year, 7-year loans. Chinese loans to infrastructure, which I looked at, like one of the most funny cases is China's loan to Montenegro in Europe to build a highway, which cost $900 million. Montenegro got, in the contract, which I have a copy of, has a 6-year grace period from 2014, which they pay nothing. And then in 2021, they start paying for 15 years more. Okay? So the loan will be repaid in 20 years after the start of the work on the building of the highway. Okay? But when you borrow from bondholders, the interest rate, by the way, the Montenegro loan is 2%. So China is actually practically losing money if we count money. Bondholders take between 6 and 11%. And you have to repay the whole loan all at once at the end of the 7 years with the interest rate. Okay? So this is a very important qualitative difference. As I said, China low interest rate, others high interest rate. The World Bank and IMF, of course, their interest rates are lower. They're close to the Chinese. But some nations were taken out of what is called low-income countries, like Sri Lanka in 2009, Kenya, and other countries, and that was not a good thing. They became medium-income countries, which meant that they cannot get concessional loans anymore at low interest rate. They have to go and borrow from the commercial market. Because when you are a poorer country, you can get preferential treatment. But they say you are a middle-income country, you don't get preferential treatment. The most important part of this whole thing is, what is the purpose of the country borrowing money? Like in the case of Sri Lanka, you had a many decades civil war, which ended, I think, in 2009. And the country was on its knees economically. So they did not have any major income sources in the country. They don't have raw materials, so they were forced to borrow money to start getting life back to normal again, doing some investments. Okay? But a lot of the investments also go to paying for consumption. In the worst case, nations borrow money, as I will show, to pay old debt with higher interest rate every time. When the day comes when they have to pay these Western banks and financial firms, they have to borrow new money to pay the old loan. Okay? But every time you have to pay higher interest rate, and when they are in trouble, their credit rating becomes much lower. You know, the global credit rating companies, they start lowering the credit worthiness of your money, and therefore you have to pay even more interest rate to get investors to give you money. Because you are a very poor guy, you will have a very bad management, so you have to pay higher interest rate. In the Chinese case, all the loans are dedicated to building infrastructure or industry or other stuff. I will come to, because that's where the whole story about the Belt and Road is so important. So what does infrastructure do? As we have seen here in China, it increases the productivity of the economy. Okay? It doesn't give you money back, but it increases the productivity of every aspect of your economy. The industry, the agriculture, the services, everything becomes better with better infrastructure. Okay? That's common sense. That's why China's loans are qualitatively different. So this is the second important point. Now we have other issues like political strings attached. When Western institutions give loans to countries, they have to dictate a lot of policies, political change, social change, even cultural change in some cases in that country, and they say if you don't do that, we'll not get the money. China does not do that. Especially no debt relief. The bondholders, especially, these are real Shylocks. They are merciless because they say we are managing the money of other people in Europe. So we have to get them back their money. So they have no mercy. On the date you have to pay back, you pay back. If you don't pay, they take you to court, where in London. And 70% of the cases, the courts in London, they judge for the interest of the Western institution. Okay? And then your country is scandalized, and you even get a lower ranking when you are taken to court by these financial firms. But other rescheduling, like through the IMF, negotiations with IMF, their conditions are that, for example, in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Zambia, and this is the new trick they are using, they say, well, you should not invest in infrastructure. If we help you, you should not invest in infrastructure because you cannot afford it. If you cannot afford healthcare, you don't do healthcare. If you don't afford schools, you don't build schools. If you don't afford roads, you don't build roads. That's life. That's what they are told. And now, since last year in Zambia, they're telling Zambia, you should even start taking loans from China. So they're targeting the Belt and Road Initiative and China-Zambia relations by saying, look, we want to help you, but you should stop taking loans from China because they are problematic. Okay? So this is what they do. China doesn't do that. China doesn't care what your political or cultural system or social system is. They want to do business. Okay? Very simple. But they also want to build friendship. So there should be a certain level of understanding and dialogue. So these are some examples on the difference between loans offered previously. This is until 2015, it's included in my book. That the US Exim Bank loans are focused on mining in Africa. Okay? Oil, gas, minerals. China does mining, but it does more transport building, does communication, water management, so on and so forth. It's more diversified. Foreign direct investment by US companies also, very big focus on mining. China, yes, they are interested in mining, but look at construction, look at manufacturing, science and tech. I think agriculture plays a key role. So there's a diversification. Here you see the focus. So that's a qualitative difference. Okay, the third point which the researcher has to answer is what causes the financial crisis in Sri Lanka, Zambia, Kenya, Montenegro, Pakistan. These are the countries I studied, but you can also generalize it to others, but you have to study each case. There's always, those countries are already in trouble before the Belt and Road Initiative comes in. By their own faults, that the government, they mismanage the financing for political reasons, for other reasons. The political system doesn't work in the country, and that's not caused by China. There are often, these countries come out of war, civil war, or terrorism. They're victims of that. And that is totally destructive for the economic and financial situation of a country. That's not caused by China. Excessive borrowing from the bond markets, I explained that. China is not the cause of that. Reliance on one source of income, like tourism, raw materials, low-end manufacturing. And so it's the same pattern in all these countries. Sri Lanka is the perfect example, but Kenya and Montenegro are similar. Sri Lanka's economy is like 50% dependent on tourism. Okay, it's a very beautiful country, you know? And Europeans, and they love to travel to Sri Lanka, also from other countries. Sri Lanka was hit by double suicide attacks on Easter Sunday, one in a church and one in a hotel. They said they were there, ISIS. You know? And that meant that it ended the tourist industry in the country immediately. So people stopped traveling to Sri Lanka. After a year, managed to go back. The tourism recovered, but then COVID-19 came, 2020. And that was the end of tourism in Sri Lanka. So the country was on its knees in terms of getting foreign currency, getting income. And it employs like hundreds of thousands of people in Sri Lanka, directly and indirectly. So tourism was finished, Sri Lanka's economy was finished. Has nothing to do with China. Then you have the problem of low-end manufacturing. Sri Lanka is known, they export tea, they have very good tea. You know, they export tea to many parts of the world, but that's not enough. Sri Lanka also has textile industry. The problem is that the textile industry, all the machinery comes from outside. Even the yarn, the cotton and stuff, comes from outside Sri Lanka. They have to import it. They have to import the fuel to produce the electricity for the factories. So what does they offer? Only the cheap labor. So there is no added value at all in Sri Lanka's textile industry. So you can just completely ignore it as part of it. Sorry. So that's the dilemma of Sri Lanka. China's effort to build infrastructure in Sri Lanka is to diversify Sri Lanka's income by becoming a logistical hub. Very, very important. I'm not going to go through the Hambantota port story because this has been debunked thoroughly by Dr. Deborah Brautigam from the Johns Hopkins University, China-Africa Institute, Research Institute. So, but China is helping make Sri Lanka a very important logistics hub, but also increase the productivity in the economy by bringing manufacturing and so on and so forth, so they can have a real income source. And also it's very important for China, very important for the Belt and Road. Other countries like Zambia, they are totally dependent on export of copper, which is controlled by 7 British, Australian, Canadian companies, and they get very little. But when the price of copper goes down, the country is almost bankrupt. It happened with the oil exporting countries too. In 2014, 2016, and 2020, the oil price went below $30 per barrel. So Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, Algeria, they were all in trouble because they all depend on one source of income. So many of these countries in the debt trap story, they have these common features. Montenegro, the same. In 2021, they were supposed to pay back the first tranche, the first part of the 20-year loan, which is only $31 million. But Montenegro's tourism has collapsed because Montenegro too is very reliant on tourism for its economy. And COVID-19 killed the tourism. So they told China, look, we cannot pay even these $31 million. So China said, no problem, you can pay the next year or the year after. Yeah? But in the media they said, oh, Montenegro is in trouble because they have to pay $1 billion back to China, but it was not true. And they even said that China will take the port in Montenegro because Montenegro cannot pay its $1 billion loan, which is completely untrue. So that's the low productivity and lack of infrastructure in the industry. I think we discussed that. I will come back to it later. Energy and food fertilizer imports. There are many nations who got hit by not only the COVID-19 but by the Ukraine crisis. Because Ukraine and Russia are the source of very important commodities. Wheat, cooking oil, but also fertilizer. So many nations in Africa actually borrow money to buy food for their people, which is a big security problem. If you can't produce your own food, you are always under pressure. So when the Ukraine war took place, many nations were in trouble because they either couldn't get the wheat or cooking oil and other food stuff or fertilizer for their agriculture. So it became a very big crisis for many nations in Africa, but also other nations. So that's not caused, it was not caused by China. So I'm just putting this because it has nothing to do with China. So anyway, we had the US Inflation Reduction Act, 22, I think, when the United States raised the interest rates, the value of dollar went up dramatically. Which means, I will come to that, that many nations have their loans are in dollar. So suddenly they have to pay much, much, much more in their own currency because their currency have devalued against the dollar. Okay, so that's another source of the problem. That was not caused by China. So it's very important to look at the causes of these countries. It takes a lot of work because you have to look at the history of their economy and financial situation, but that's necessary hard work. So this is like a Sri Lanka's case. You see here, when the war ends and then start borrowing, you have an accumulative, like Japan was loaning money, but it's accumulated, but then it went down. China starts here. At the same time, the bondholders, the private bondholders, suddenly go, skyrocketing. So, but still, China is just a minor actor in Sri Lanka's economy. This is an illustration. We had this year, there was a big crisis in Kenya because Kenya was not able to pay a certain, everybody was talking about China, but it had nothing to do with China because Kenya had to pay back money to the bondholders. They were Western bondholders. And then they managed to get an agreement with the IMF with very harsh conditions. As I said, no investment in infrastructure. They have to raise the taxes on everybody in Kenya. So there were riots. There were demonstrations and riots, and there's a lot of problems in Kenya. But everybody was talking, even in the Swedish television, the reporters said, these riots were because these were people demonstrating against China, which is not true. They were demonstrating against the government policy as part of its package with the IMF. But this was you can see it here. This is from this year. This is a news report. On 12th of February, Kenya tapped the international bond market to raise cash and buy back a 10-year euro bond of US dollar 2 billion. They have to pay back 2 billion this year. That matures in June this year. The US dollar 1.5 billion bond, the new one, which will mature in 2031, was oversubscribed 4 times. So it was very good investment. Why? Because Kenya has to pay 10% interest rate on that bond. Instead of so 10% on that bond. Imagine if Kenya cannot manage its economy. What will happen in 2031? You have to pay interest rate of 10% every year for this. So this is the dilemma of those countries. They get in trouble, they have to borrow money. And they have to borrow money at higher interest rates. And they have to decrease the investment in the infrastructure, which will save them. So as I said the other day, it's like you shoot yourself in the head to get rid of the headache. That's what you do with this kind of policy. And this has nothing to do with China. Chinese loans to Kenya for the railway, for the port, for many other things. These are long-term. They will mature in 2035. These are 15-year, 20-year long loans. I discussed this question of the currency. When a country devalues its currency, they have to pay twice as much in local currency for the same dollar loan. Even Chinese loans to those countries are in dollar. So it's a big problem for those countries to even pay back China. Now we have a lot of discussion in the BRIX countries and in the global south on diversifying, getting out of the dollar trap, because this is what happens, because the dollar is controlled by politics as a tool of power, geopolitics. It has nothing to do with the economics. The American economy has been going down for 40 years, but the American dollar keeps going up because it's a politically steered tool. The same case in Kenya, their currency has been devaluing. So we come to the next part. How are we going to manage to get credit, loans, financing for infrastructure in the next 10 years? Given all the trouble we have in the world, as I described, many of these global south countries that have financial problems.